What happens when a farmer from Nebraska offers his homemade machine to the Army? He was kicked off the base. But what happened next made the generals hide their reports. You could smell diesel and stubbornness from 50 yards away. It was a cold April morning in 1943 when Roy Eckhart, a 43-year-old farm mechanic from rural Nebraska, parked his muddy pickup truck right outside the supply depot at Camp Carson. The war had finally come for him, not with bullets or glory, but with red tape, mud, and a busted-down logistics line that nobody at HQ wanted to talk about. Roy wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even officially part of the war effort, as some like to say with chests puffed out. But he showed up anyway, with a welder, 2 half-dead tractors, and a half-baked idea that was about to punch bureaucracy square in the jaw. He hadn't slept in 2 days. 3 convoys had stalled outside Fort Carson over the last week, all because of supply chain delays and mudslides that turned roads into swamps. Command said it was under control. Roy knew it wasn't. He'd been driving one of the backup haulers and watched good men sitting idle, engines dead, rations low, while higher-ups debated diagrams over coffee. That morning, Roy had bolted 2 tractors together. Literally. He stripped the cabs off both, welded their frames into a single articulated joint, added the double-torque gearbox he'd repurposed from a harvester back on the farm, and rigged it all into what looked like a Frankenstein monster of steel and wheels. No paint, no military markings, just raw function. Ugly as sin. But it could plow through 10 feet of mud and pull a tank behind it. And he was proud of it, until they laughed. "Where the hell'd you drag that from?" barked a man in a starched uniform, clipboard in hand, standing between Roy and the depot gate. Roy stepped out of the truck bed, gloves charred, face still smeared with grease. "Built it. Yesterday. She's not pretty, but she'll move your stuck rigs out of the mud." The man didn't even blink. "This is a military base. Unauthorized equipment isn't allowed within perimeter lines, especially civilian improvisations." Roy pointed back at his machine. "You've got 3 convoys dead in the water, and they're not getting unstuck with permission slips. This'll do the job." Another officer appeared, younger but sharper, gold bars on his collar. He took one look at the machine and smirked. "Let me guess," he said, circling it like it might grow teeth. "You figured welding 2 tractors together would magically make a military-grade recovery vehicle." "No magic," Roy said. "Just torque, weight, and traction. I don't need a manual. I need someone willing to let this thing work." The young officer looked him up and down. "You're not even enlisted." "Didn't stop me from showing up." There was silence, the thick, heavy kind that settles between people when one of them's about to do something bold and the other's too stuck in a rule book to follow. Then the rejection came. Hard. "Sir," the clipboard man snapped, "this is precisely the kind of civilian interference that wastes military time and resources. Get it out of here, immediately." Roy blinked. "You've got trucks buried axle deep in that mountain pass, and this thing can pull 'em out. You'd rather leave 'em stuck than try something new?" The older officer didn't even dignify it with a full sentence. Just waved him off like a dog scratching at the wrong door. "Remove this vehicle from base property," he repeated. Roy didn't move. Not yet. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked from the machine to the barracks, to the distant hills where the stalled convoys were still sitting. Men were out there, waiting, burning time, burning daylight, burning options. "I didn't come here to break rules," he said finally, voice low, steady. "I came here to get your boys moving again." "You came here to play engineer," the officer snapped, "and we don't need any more amateur ideas clogging up the yard. You think you're smarter than the Corps? Than the people building these machines?" "No," Roy said, turning back toward his rig. "I just think sitting still ain't working." He drove off, not in anger, in disappointment. The welds rattled against the weight of his own frustration. The machine bounced over the gravel, slow but steady. A few enlisted guys nearby watched him go, quiet. One gave him a thumbs up behind the sergeant's back. Another mouthed, "That was badass." But Roy wasn't smiling. That thing he'd built, it could have saved hours, maybe lives, and now it was just another rejected idea left to rot outside the perimeter line. By the time he got back to the temporary garage near the rail line, the sun had cracked through the low clouds. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from helplessness. It had been years since someone made him feel small. Not since the Dust Bowl days, when bankers told him he didn't know how to run his own land. And yet here he was again. Same kind of men, same kind of faces, different war. He sat down on a crate, lit a cigarette, and stared at the machine. 2 tractors, 1 idea, 0 support. Later that afternoon, the depot sent an official notice to the logistics command. Unauthorized vehicle observed near base. Civilian interference noted. No further action required. Roy never got a copy of the report, but he didn't need it. He'd heard all he needed with that one word. Amateur. He was supposed to disappear now. Go home, file it under tried and denied. Let the machine rust behind a barn somewhere in Kansas and tell himself he did his part. But he didn't move. He sat there for hours, watching, waiting, listening to the sound of wasted time. He knew something they didn't, something they wouldn't listen to even if he shouted it from the rooftops. The machine worked. It worked better than anything they had. And they'd just slammed the gate in its face. We've just begun this story. But trust me, it's only going to get more intense. Stay with it to find out what happens when Roy faces a system that fears anything it can't control. It started raining again just past midnight. Cold, cruel kind of rain. The kind that seeps through your coat and into your bones like it's got something personal against you. Roy Eckhart didn't flinch. He was still out by the freight yard, hunched over a broken axle from one of the transport rigs left behind when the convoys stalled. No orders, no clearance, just grit, a gas lantern and a welding torch that hissed like it wanted to argue with someone. He wasn't fixing it for a medal. He was fixing it because someone had to, and nobody else seemed interested. By morning, 2 of the mechanics from the depot showed up in their pressed coveralls, sipping bad coffee from tin mugs. "You again," one of them muttered. Roy didn't even look up. "Yeah, me." The younger one, Jenkins, barely 25, pointed at the heap of rust and steel Roy had just reassembled with baling wire and ingenuity. "That thing even safe to start." "Not for the rule book," Roy muttered, "but it'll get through the pass." Jenkins looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to help, but not enough to risk the wrong kind of attention. That was the thing about Army protocol. It didn't just tell you what to do. It taught you not to act without permission, even when permission was the problem. "You're not supposed to be working on military equipment," the other mechanic said, a little too loud, like someone might be watching. Roy stood up slow, stretched his back, wiped grease off his hands onto a rag that hadn't been white in 10 years. "You gonna write me up?" he asked, dry as the Nebraska prairie. The man didn't answer, because before he could, a jeep pulled in from the road, fast. 2 officers stepped out. One Roy recognized from the rejection at the gate. The other wore a polished belt and that clipped tone that told you everything about him in the first 5 words. "Roy Eckhart? That's me. Step away from the vehicle." Roy took one last glance at the makeshift hauler. Rain still dripped from the freshly welded frame. That thing was stronger than it looked, and so was Roy. "What's the problem, Lieutenant?" "You're in violation of Army property codes, tampering with restricted equipment, and trespassing on a logistics repair zone." Roy didn't even blink. "I'm fixing your problem." The officer stepped forward, voice rising. "You've been warned. Your presence here is unauthorized. You are hereby banned from engaging with any military equipment, assets, or repair zones on this base or any adjacent operations. Effective immediately." A pause. Then the sentence that burned. "You'll never touch military equipment again." The words cut deeper than they were supposed to. Not because Roy had dreams of becoming some decorated war hero, but because they didn't understand what he was actually doing. He wasn't meddling. He was answering a need that nobody else wanted to solve. The rest of the day bled out in silence. Roy didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just packed his torch, rolled up the wires, and left the yard slower than he'd arrived. The 2 officers watched like they'd just won something. Like shutting down a man with ideas somehow made the war easier to win. What they didn't see was Jenkins following Roy 20 minutes later. Quiet. Nervous. He caught up to him by the train siding where Roy kept his tools in an old freight crate. "You got a minute?" Roy didn't turn. "You're not supposed to talk to me, son." "I know. I saw what that thing did. Your rig, the dual-axle weld. That's smart work." "Didn't count for much," Roy muttered. "I think it did. Some of the guys saw the test run. Word spreading. Someone said one of the stuck trucks moved 2 yards with that setup. No chains. No winch." Roy lit a cigarette, fingers still shaking from cold and adrenaline. "Won't matter. They've already made up their minds." Jenkins hesitated, then said something Roy didn't expect. "My brother's stuck up there, in one of those convoys. I don't care what the manual says. I'd take your rig over a textbook any day." Roy looked at him for the first time. Really looked. The kid was scared. Not of Roy, of everything else. Of a system that didn't have room for courage unless it came in uniform. Of officers who followed maps written by people who'd never seen a dirt road during spring thaw. "You want to help?" Roy asked. Jenkins nodded. Once. "Then don't report this conversation." He didn't. That night, Roy broke the rules. On purpose. He wheeled his rig out from behind the crate. Tarped, silent, waiting. There was a dirt trail behind the depot no one used anymore. Overgrown, narrow, muddy enough to keep most jeeps away. But not Roy's beast. It took him 2 hours to get within eyeshot of the first stalled convoy. What he saw chilled him. 3 rigs, camouflaged but sunk down to their wheel wells. Rainwater pooled around them like little ponds. A half-dozen men huddled beneath ponchos, smoke rising from a weak fire built under a tarp of ration boxes. They weren't abandoned, but they weren't being saved either. No rescue vehicles, no tow cables, just mud, fatigue, and waiting. Roy killed the engine and walked in slow, hands raised like he was the one trespassing, even though these were American men, on American ground, in an American war. The corporal nearest the fire stood up fast, blinking through the rain. "You ain't with command," he said. "Nope," Roy answered. "I'm with common sense." The men stared at him, then at the machine behind him. "What is that thing?" Roy lit another cigarette, inhaled. "Call it stubbornness on wheels." And without waiting for permission, because he knew no one would give it, Roy started unhooking the tarp. The soldiers didn't stop him. They helped. Because out there, rank didn't matter. Results did. Back at base, someone noticed the missing rig. It didn't take long before whispers turned into warnings. "Civilian theft," one officer muttered. "Violation of base order," another said. But nobody could deny what happened next. Because by dawn, one of the 3 stuck trucks rolled into camp under its own power, caked in mud, frame rattling, pulled by a Frankenstein rig no one ever authorized. And behind the wheel, soaked, covered in ash but calm, sat Roy Eckhart. Didn't say a word, didn't need to. The engine did all the talking, and the room fell silent. We're right on the edge of the climax. What happens next will change everything, not just for Roy, but for the entire chain of command. You're not going to want to miss how this confrontation unfolds. If you also believe that sometimes one unconventional decision is worth more than hundreds of orders, subscribe to our channel. We tell real stories of people who were initially ridiculed and then hailed as heroes. Write in the comments. Do you think the Army would make the same mistake today as it did with this person? They tried to arrest him. Not with handcuffs or barking threats, but with paperwork. Roy Eckhart stood in front of the logistics tent, soaked to the bone, engine grease in the lines of his face, while the captain, with a jaw clenched tighter than his fist, read out the charges like he was reciting scripture. Unauthorized operation of military property, violation of depot perimeter protocol, disregard of command structure, civilian impersonation of active personnel. Behind him, the rig idled, coughing, wheezing, one belt rattling like an old man with bad lungs. But it had done what a half-dozen official vehicles couldn't. Pulled a 4-ton supply truck through 16 inches of mud. The captain took a breath. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Roy didn't flinch. He pulled a folded, oil-stained notepad from his coat, flipped it open, and held it out. "What's this?" "Measurements," Roy said. "That rig pulled 8,200 pounds at a 17% incline, unassisted. I logged the pressure points on both axles and the friction delta on the tires. That's raw field data, not theory." The captain didn't take the paper. Roy tucked it back into his coat like he expected that. "Sir," came a voice from behind the desk. "Jenkins." Voice shaking but not backing down. "He's not wrong. That truck's been out there for 6 days. No movement. Nobody came. This man got it out in 4 hours." The captain turned his head. "You're out of line, Private." "No, sir," Jenkins said, standing straighter. "I'm just out of patience." A few heads turned, some nodded subtly, and that's when it cracked. Not the rig, not the ranks, but the silence. Someone in the back cleared their throat. Then a sergeant stepped forward. "Captain, permission to speak freely." The captain's jaw twitched. Denied. But it didn't matter, because now the others were moving, slowly, cautiously, but toward Roy. They'd seen the mud, the rain, the stuck trucks, the lost hours. They didn't care about orders anymore, they cared about results. And Roy had delivered. The captain's face flushed. He leaned closer. "I don't care what this man welded in his backyard," he growled. I will not have discipline fall apart over some civilian cowboy fantasy. Roy's voice cut through the tension. You want discipline, he said, or you want to win this war. Silence. Then another voice spoke, deeper, older. Why not both? Everyone turned. The man stepping into the tent wasn't in a pressed uniform. He wore a canvas coat, mud up to his knees, and a colonel's insignia barely visible beneath the dirt. Colonel Darrow. Old school, grizzled, and not known for patience. I saw that machine, he said, walking past the captain without looking at him. Saw it dragging a fuel truck through terrain that broke 3 half-tracks and a bulldozer. He looked at Roy, then at the machine, then back. That yours? Roy nodded once. Darrow tilted his head. You name it. Roy hesitated, then shrugged. Didn't seem important. It is now. They called it the Mule. Ugly, low, loud, but it worked. That afternoon, the Mule was cleared for limited auxiliary use under direct field command. No parade, no announcement. Just a quiet change in orders that gave Roy provisional authority to assist in recovery ops. Supervised, of course. Still not an enlisted man, still not saluted, but no longer dismissed. And that changed everything. The next morning, 3 more convoys were scheduled for movement. Terrain was dicey. The weather hadn't let up. But now the Mule led the column, Roy driving, Jenkins riding shotgun, a pair of wide-eyed mechanics watching the beast in action. The first slope came fast. 2 supply jeeps bogged down at the base. Roy didn't ask for orders. He just shifted gears and rolled in. The Mule didn't hesitate. The joint weld flexed. Tires clawed like an animal, and within minutes both jeeps were hooked. Tugged and freed, no chains snapped, no winches burned out. Applause? None. But when Roy stepped out to check the front axle, one of the transport officers handed him a sandwich from his own rations. Didn't say a word, but the message was clear. You are one of us now. That night, Roy sat on the back bumper of the Mule, watching the campfires burn across the ridge. Soldiers told stories. Smoke drifted up toward the black Colorado sky. And that's when the captain returned. Alone, still in uniform, still stiff. He didn't salute. Just stood there, boots crunching gravel, arms crossed. I was wrong, he said, eventually. Roy didn't answer. I followed the book, the captain continued. It's what I was trained to do. But the book doesn't win every fight. Roy finally looked up. You saying I did? No, the captain said. I'm saying you might help us survive the next one. A pause, then he extended his hand. Roy stared at it. Rough palms, clean fingernails. He shook it. No speeches. No backslapping, just mutual recognition. Of function over form, of courage over custom, of a man who showed up when it mattered, and built something no one else had the imagination and or the guts to try. You felt the impact. Now, wait, until you see what happens when that machine enters actual combat territory. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new kind of resistance. They didn't blow up the Mule. They just tried to bury it in forms. 1 week after Roy Eckhart pulled his 3rd convoy out of a flooded mountain corridor, with no losses, no breakdowns, and faster than the official estimates by half, the orders came down. Cease use of unauthorized vehicle in all forward operations pending formal review. Typed, stamped, signed. It was addressed not to Roy, but to Colonel Darrow, the same man who had given him the green light. And now even he was boxed in. What the hell does pending review even mean? Roy asked, pacing a hole into the garage floor. Colonel Darrow didn't answer immediately. He stood by the workbench, flipping the paper over and over in his hand, like maybe it would disappear if he stared long enough. "It means someone's scared," he finally said. "Of the mule? Of what it represents?" Roy stopped. "It represents working solutions. That's all." Darrow looked up. "No, it represents breaking chain of command, skipping procurement, challenging the way this machine works. Not just that one," he pointed to the mule, "but this one." He tapped the paper. "The military-industrial machine, the politics, the men with stars on their shoulders and their names on blueprints they never touched." Roy sat down hard on the bench. "So, what now?" "They're sending someone from Washington." Roy didn't like the sound of that. He liked it even less when the inspector arrived. Major Gerald Wexley III had the kind of face that looked allergic to dirt. His shoes were polished, his clipboard full, and his smile rehearsed like a salesman peddling morality in a war zone. He didn't shake Roy's hand, just nodded like he was acknowledging a mailbox. "I've read the reports," he said, walking a slow circle around the mule. "Innovative, risky, entirely unsanctioned." "It worked," Roy said, wiping oil from his hands. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" Wexley didn't answer, just jotted something down. Colonel Darrow stood nearby, silent as stone. The hearing was held in the back of the logistics tent. No uniforms, just tension. Roy wasn't invited, not formally, but he showed up anyway, standing outside the canvas walls, just close enough to hear the raised voices inside. Words like protocol violation, mechanical liability, operational inconsistency, and then Darrow's voice, low and steady. "The man's done more with scrap and guts than your entire quartermaster chain with 10 months and $1 million. A pause. Then Wexley again. "This isn't a war zone. It's a chessboard, and you've let a pawn start moving like a queen." That line stayed with Roy. Long after the meeting, long after the mule was rolled into storage, wrapped in tarp, sealed under order C-472F. Experimental vehicle subject to future review. Use prohibited outside test environments. That night, Roy sat on top of a crate behind the barracks, listening to the idle sounds of engines being prepped for the next shipment. Trucks he knew would get stuck again. He didn't light a cigarette. He didn't speak. He just stared into the dark. And for the first time, he wondered if they were ever going to let him do the thing he was actually good at. Helping. The next few days were colder, not the weather. The camp. Men nodded less. Jenkins kept his head down. One of the mechanics Roy had trained was reassigned without warning. The officers stopped asking questions, stopped sharing intel. It was like the entire camp had been reminded who was allowed to matter. Roy was a civilian again. On paper, off the board. And yet, when the snow hit early that Thursday and the 4th supply truck slid off the mountain bend near Red Elk Pass, guess who they sent? Not Roy, but guess who showed up? He didn't ask for clearance, didn't bring the mule, just hiked the 5 miles through slush and wind, toolbox strapped to his back, boots torn from wear. By the time he reached the crash site, the medics were already pulling 2 men from the cab. The rest of the convoy sat behind the jackknife truck, stuck, engines off, eyes hollow. No command vehicle, no backup, no plan. Roy didn't waste time. He grabbed the chain, set the brakes, and crawled under the truck. Broken axle, rear tires locked, gearbox cracked. He could fix it. Enough to roll if someone had a torch. He didn't. But Jenkins arrived 10 minutes later, panting, carrying a fuel pack and a portable welder he'd smuggled out of the motor pool. "Figured you might need this," he said, eyes darting. Roy nodded once. Don't get caught." "I already did," Jenkins said. Then he dropped the gear and stood watch. By nightfall, they moved the wreck. 6 trucks followed down the ridge. No radioed orders, no official reports. Just grit, frostbite, and 2 men doing what the system refused to admit it needed. When they got back to base, no one clapped. But someone left hot food by Roy's cot. And a spare pair of gloves, anonymous. That said everything. In the tent that night, Darrow stopped by. No warning, no boots, just quiet. "You were seen," he said. Roy nodded. "I can't protect you next time." Roy looked up. "Then don't." Darrow watched him for a long time. Then, "They want to take the mule apart, ship it back to D.C. for assessment. That means scrap. You know that." Roy's voice didn't shake. "Then let them take it. Just give me the blueprints first." Darrow frowned. "You gonna build another one?" "No," he stood, eyes level. "I'm gonna build 3. They tried to shut him down. They tried to bury his ideas. But what Roy does next, it won't be quiet. It won't be safe. And it won't follow the rules. You're not ready for how far this man's about to go. The barn wasn't a barn. It used to be. Long before the war, before the Army took over the western stretch of the rail yard and turned everything into a depot. Now it was just a sagging shell on the edge of the base, half buried in snowdrifts, forgotten by everyone except Roy and a handful of men who didn't believe in waiting for permission to solve problems. Inside, sparks danced, metal groaned, and something was being born. The plans weren't official. They weren't even complete. But Roy knew every line of them by heart. The blueprints had been drafted by hand, passed in pieces, folded into lunch tins and toolboxes, whispered over engine noise between men who never admitted they were helping him. One was a mechanic from Pennsylvania who'd seen his first tank crack in Tunisia. Another was a welder from Mississippi, discharged after an attitude problem, which Roy understood to mean common sense and a spine. Jenkins, of course, was the first to show up and the last to leave, still technically on duty, but now spending his nights elbow-deep in gears he wasn't authorized to touch. The goal wasn't rebellion. It was survival and justice. Because since the mule had been locked away under military seal, 4 more convoys had stalled. 2 required aerial supply drops. 1 lost an entire truck to sabotage when partisans hit the stuck unit during an ambush. Men were getting stranded. And Roy? Roy was done waiting for signatures. They didn't call it the Mule Tsukun. That name was retired. Too visible now. They called this one Ghost. It was faster, shorter, welded tighter. 2 engines running parallel instead of series, with a split differential design Roy had copied from a threshing machine back home. The Ghost could rotate in place, could pull sideways if needed, had chains built into the treads, like claws gripping the earth itself. Every part of it said, I wasn't made for display. I was made to move. By the 3rd week, it was alive. By the 4th, it was needed. Word reached Roy late one night. Convoy 7C had gone dark past Little Ridge. 5 trucks, including fuel, medical, and encrypted radio equipment. Last transmission was static, and one garbled phrase. Road collapsed. Official command reaction? We wait for recon. Roy didn't. He gathered the team. No orders, no badges, just believers, and rolled Ghost out under the full moon, wrapped in canvas, muffled wheels. The motor didn't roar. It growled. By the time they reached the drop-off point, the snow was thick. The roads were worse, and the last Army map had listed this trail as impassable. The same map that got men stuck in the first place. Roy didn't bring that map. He brought chains, fuel, and fury. 2 miles in, They found the first truck, half buried. 2 men alive, 1 unconscious, 1 with a shattered ankle, no radio, no backup. They'd been there 30 hours, surviving on melted snow and smuggled chocolate. Jenkins jumped from the cab before Ghost stopped moving. The rescue wasn't elegant. They chained the Ghost to the rear axle, reversed it slow, spun once in the mud, and nearly jackknifed the whole system before the truck finally broke loose with a lurch that made every man yell like a fight had just been won. 3 hours later, the rest of the convoy was accounted for. 5 trucks, 9 men, 1 impossible road. Cleared, quietly, illegally, successfully. When they rolled back into camp before dawn, Roy expected handcuffs. Instead, he got silence. No one met them, no one reported them. But when he reached the back of the garage, the same spot where the mule had once been tarped and locked, he found something taped to the door. Just a piece of paper, no header, no seal, no name. It read, "We see what you're doing. Cease immediately. This is your final warning." That was it. Roy read it once, then folded it, stuck it in his pocket, and walked inside. Jenkins met him at the workbench. "You gonna stop?" Roy shook his head. "They've got papers. I've got steel." The next 48 hours blurred. New men came. Not volunteers, not officially. Just present, helping, asking questions, carrying parts. Word was out. Ghost had moved where maps said, "Don't bother." And now even senior staff were beginning to notice the baselines shifting. Not in doctrine, in morale. People were thinking for themselves, measuring results. And those results had Roy's fingerprints all over them. That's when the crackdown came. Tuesday morning. Inspection. Unannounced. 6 trucks rolled in from District Command, led by Major Wexley and 2 uniformed MPs. They didn't smile. They didn't ask. They ordered. All unauthorized vehicles seized. All civilian mechanics removed. Workstations locked. Tool crates tagged. The barn sealed under Military Code 114B, investigative custody. Roy wasn't arrested, but they made sure he watched. Watched as the Ghost was unhooked. Watched as men he'd built trust with were ordered away. Watched as the engine he'd poured 200 hours into was shut down mid-cycle and dragged onto a flatbed like a corpse. No words, no goodbyes, just power, flexed. That night Roy sat alone on the rail siding. The cold was worse, the silence heavier, and for the first time in months he didn't know what came next. They had shut him down. Again. But as he looked at his hands, blistered, blackened, still shaking from the last weld, he realized something deeper. They could stop the Ghost. They couldn't stop the need for it. Because the road hadn't changed. The rain still fell. The convoys still stalled. And the system still couldn't move without men like him. Men who didn't wait for orders to do what was right. Roy looked out into the dark, where the mountain roads twisted like question marks, then whispered to no one, "You can take the rig. You can take the tools, but I'm not done." They've taken everything from him, but they forgot who Roy is without a machine. What he does next. It doesn't come with blueprints, and it doesn't need permission. The final chapter's coming, and it's going to hit harder than anyone's ready for. They came back in silence. 4 men, covered in mud, limping down the ridge trail just after dusk. No headlights, no escort. One of them had blood on his shoulder, another clutched his ribs like something inside had snapped days ago. They looked like ghosts. Not of war, but of what bureaucracy did to people who tried to survive it. They had names, ranks, files, but for 3 days they'd had no radio, no rations, and no movement. Convoy 12B had been rerouted through Black Hollow by some officer with a clipboard and zero dirt under his fingernails. Roy had warned them. The pass floods after 2 inches of rain. The snowpack melts fast, but Command waved the report off. Route recon already logged. Stick to plan. They did, and it failed. 2 trucks lost. 1 flipped. No evac, no backup, just weather, bad maps, and protocol. The 4 survivors. They'd walked 19 miles back to camp. The others, still up there, still waiting. Roy wasn't in the garage when they returned. He was in the radio shack, a condemned wooden box behind the motor pool, used mostly to store busted gear no one wanted to account for. Inside, he had a chair, a thermos, and a busted receiver he'd soldered together from discarded parts. He wasn't listening to enemy transmissions. He was listening for silence. And that's exactly what he heard. The same silence that always came before men started dying for someone else's paperwork. By morning, the news had cracked through the chain. Command went quiet. No press release. No search party. Just 1 line buried in the dispatch log. Convoy 12B, status unknown. Recon delayed due to terrain. But terrain didn't stop Roy. What had? The locks on his barn, the seizure of his rig, the reassignment of every man who'd ever lifted a wrench beside him. But here's the thing. You don't shut down an idea just by sealing a door. Not when that idea lives in the hands of 30 mechanics who'd seen too much. In the boots of a corporal whose brother never made it back. In the worn-out palms of a farmer who no longer cared if he was allowed to care. Roy stood outside Colonel Darrow's office at 0700 sharp. Didn't knock, just walked in. The colonel was mid-conference call with Central Logistics. He didn't mute. "Sir," Roy said calmly, "I need 5 men, 1 welder, and 12 hours." Darrow didn't blink. "They'll charge me with insubordination." Roy stared. "They'll charge you with obstruction if we don't pull those boys out." The voice on the line crackled. "Who's in the room with you?" Darrow muted it and handed Roy the key. Not to the barn, to the train hangar. That's where they'd stashed the Ghost after the seizure, boxed between 2 flatbeds, wheels locked, battery drained. Roy didn't touch the ignition. Not yet. He turned to the crew. 5 men in borrowed gear, Jenkins among them. No stripes, no rank, just skill. They didn't ask what the plan was. They already knew. They built the rig in 4 hours. They weren't supposed to. They weren't even supposed to have tools. But no one stopped them. Not this time. They added dual intake valves, reinforced the front axle, brought in a spare winch from the scrapyard, and bolted it directly to the frame. There was no paint, no name, just purpose. By 1400, the Ghost rolled out of the hangar under its own power, for the first time since being impounded. Roy behind the wheel, Jenkins riding high. No authorization, no blessing, just a destination, Black Hollow. The rescue wasn't heroic. It was hard. The pass was worse than feared. 1 truck submerged to its windows, another pinned beneath a rock slide. Roy didn't make speeches. He pulled, he climbed, he crawled beneath axles and strapped chains around tires while the snow tried to bury the wrecks for good. The Ghost stalled once, almost tipped twice. But by nightfall the ridge was clear, and 7 men who weren't supposed to survive were sitting in the back of the rig, wrapped in blankets, clutching thermoses. Alive. They got back at 03:07 and no one was asleep. The entire base was lit, because someone had leaked the location of the Ghost's movement. Reporters had shown up at the gate. So had MPs. So had an official envoy from Western Command. Waiting, not to welcome them, but to explain them away. Roy climbed down slow. His legs were numb, his knuckles split. But his eyes were clear. Wexley was there, of course, clipboard in hand, 2 pens clipped to his lapel like they were medals. "You violated federal orders," he said, without looking up. Roy nodded. "And saved 7 men. That's not your decision to make." Roy stepped closer. "It is when yours got them killed." The crowd behind them didn't cheer, but they didn't look away either. And for once, Wexley had nothing to write down, because there was no form for what had just happened. The next day, the ghost was moved again, but this time not under top, not in secret. It rolled into a parade ground, parked beside a column of authorized equipment, bigger, cleaner, slower. And there Roy gave his only public statement. 1 line, no microphone, just gravel underfoot and the eyes of 100 men who knew exactly what it cost to get here. "We didn't build this thing to break the rules. We built it because the rules were already broken." They never charged him. They couldn't, because a story had already left the base. A photo, ghost in the snow, men wrapped in blankets. Roy standing beside the frame, looking like a man who hadn't asked to be right, but had no other choice. The papers ran it with one headline: "Out of the mud, into history." Wexley was reassigned, the procurement process temporarily modernized. The ghost filed under Experimental Transport Initiative, still not a regulation, but never ignored again. And Roy, he didn't stay. He'd built what needed to be built. And once the road was passable, he went home. No medals, no rank. Just a handshake from every man who'd ever stalled out on a forgotten trail and prayed someone out there still knew how to weld. Some men fight wars with weapons. Others fight them with what they have. A wrench, a torch, a machine they weren't supposed to build, and when the system forgets how to move, it's the stubborn ones like Roy Eckhart who remind the world, the mission isn't to follow orders. The mission is to bring people home.